Hey folks, welcome back to Thursday afternoon's trips through American history. Once again, it'd be great if somebody could indicate to me that I'm actually live, and there we go, I'm all set. Um, as I say, welcome back to this trip through American history, based loosely on my new book, How the South Won the Civil War. Uh, I have let me first do my disclaimer. My name is Heather Cox Richardson, and I am a professor of history. I'm doing these on my own. They have nothing to do with my employer. Although I don't suspect my employer would object to the idea of me talking about history to a wide audience. But I have to say, I have this thing I keep driving my students nuts with and have for years, and that is that every single time I come into class to teach something new, I always say, well, this is the best material ever. This is my favorite lecture ever. And it must get tiring with there's one exception where I was going to say, I hate this lecture. I just got to cover it. I kind of do that just so that they know I'm not a puppy dog. But that being said, I hate to do it to you, but this is my favorite material ever today. Of course, last week's was my favorite, and the week before that, and the week before that. But today is really special to me because it's Reconstruction. And I don't know about you guys, but when I began to study history, I loathed Reconstruction because I didn't understand it. It was like there was a week where we studied African Americans, and then all of a sudden they completely dropped out of the picture. And then all of a sudden we were talking about, Andrew Carnegie, who seemed to appear from nowhere in 1877. And, then all of a sudden there was something about a tariff, and, it was impossible for me to figure out what was going on. And then there was presidential Reconstruction and Congressional Reconstruction. I mean, what was with that? And nobody ever talked about the West or women. So I had grown up on Laura Ingalls Wilder. So this didn't make any sense to me because I knew that she was born in February of 1867, right before Congress passed the Military Reconstruction Act. And when she died, there were still military advisors. They were not still. There were military advisors in Vietnam. And clearly in her life, she didn't say, well, in this decade, I'm going to think about Black people. And in this decade, I'm going to think about industrialization. Clearly, somehow she saw it as a unit. So I couldn't stand to do Reconstruction. And my first book was on the Civil War. I didn't really want to deal with Reconstruction at all. And then, of course, I fell in love with Reconstruction and still love Reconstruction because, to me, this is where all of our lines were laid down for the present. So that's what I want to do today, is walk you through that material. And I hope I hit some of the best stories because, like I say, this is by far my favorite period in American history, except for all the others. Anyway, so let me start with where we've been. And that is that I've tried to lay out in the last couple of weeks the idea that there is at the heart of America a paradox, that the concept of human equality depended for the founders on the understanding that certain people could never be equal, that women and people of color could not be equal. They were simply written out of the equation by part of the body politic. So what that meant is that the founders could come up with the idea of equality, but their equality was based on inequality. So it was essentially equality for white men and inequality for everyone else. And what I have argued in the new book is that oligarchs have been able to use that equation to argue a corollary to it. And that is that on the occasions when it appears that people of color and women are approaching equality, equality for white men must be disappearing. That is, if equality depends on inequality, when everybody achieves equality, some people must be unequal. That is, the system will turn. It's a rhetorical device, but it's a rhetorical device that has been extraordinarily powerful. So what I've laid out here before is the story, first of all, of the concept of true American democracy, Lincolnian democracy, the idea that every person, and of course they were defining it as men, but they were beginning to expand it to women in the 1860s and up to 1872. The idea that people, every man truly did have the right to equality of opportunity, whether you are a person of color or a white man or even perhaps female. And that the Civil War meant that vision of American democracy won over the hierarchical ideals that the Confederacy had adopted. The idea that some people were just better than others, and that society would work better so long as those people were in charge, those few leaders who had money and education and knew how to run the economy. That's the idea that the Confederacy developed, and of course Lincoln and his Republican Party said, no, that's not the way democracy is supposed to work. In fact, everybody should have equality of opportunity, because the real work and the real thought, the innovation, happens at the bottom, not at the top. And that's how you move society forward, and that won. But then I laid out last week the idea that, in fact, the story would have been over right there in 1865, except for the fact that in the immediate post-war period, Easterners moved west in high numbers, and they moved west across the Mississippi River into a land that had its own history entirely, a history very different than that of the East. And that history was one of hierarchies, and one of racial hierarchies, and one where those hierarchies were exacerbated, not relieved, but exacerbated during the war, as the United States armies fought and corralled and massacred Indian populations, reinforcing the ideas in the West and also back in the East that somehow some people simply weren't as good as everybody else. So moving into that region after the war enabled people who retained the concept of a hierarchical society to engraft that system back into the American West. And what I want to do today is talk about how that plays out in the immediate post-war years, and then next week how it plays out in the late 19th century. And I can't believe I'm going to say this, but really the late 19th century is my favorite period. I just realized I'm thinking about all the great stuff I'll get to do next week, and I just already broke my rule there. Anyway, so I want to start here with Reconstruction and with what that means. And what I'm going to argue today, and there's a number of ways to look at Reconstruction. As I said early on here, I am taking you on one thread through American history. We could do an entirely different thread on the environment, or on clothing, or on social movements, or any number of things. I'm following this thread through American history, and the definition of Reconstruction that I am using is one that resonated at the time with the people participating in national Reconstruction, and that was the idea of the reconstruction of the U.S. government, from where it had been divided by the seceding states into a whole unit again. So Reconstruction then takes place in the years after the war, and there are many ways in which Reconstruction stretches back to the beginning of the war, and some historians have even argued it starts before the war. So Reconstruction is a hotly contested area, but for me today, Reconstruction is going to start after Robert E. Lee surrenders his army, only his army, at Appomattox Courthouse, and after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And that assassination is enormously important in American history for any number of reasons. Of course, it's our first political assassination, but also because what it means is that Lincoln's vice president steps into the presidency. And Lincoln's vice president is a man named Andrew Johnson. And Andrew Johnson is not a Republican. This was a mixed ticket, and the story behind that is fascinating. Maybe if these ever continue, I'll explain why he was on that ticket. But he's a Democrat, and he does not trust the Republican Party at all. He's a Southern Democrat. He's from Tennessee, and a unionist. He stayed with the Union. But he believes that the Republican Party during the war, as it has taken such power upon itself to not only to raise the Army and the Navy, but also to fund them and to put people onto Western lands through the Homestead Act. He actually likes the Land-Grant College Act. He likes state universities. But the assumption of power by the Republicans worries him terribly, because he worries that it's going to mean the Democrats will never again take power. And of course, he's a Democrat, and now he's a Democratic president who wants to be president for more than the remainder of Lincoln's term. So his political future depends on curbing the Republican Party. That being said, he hates the Southern slave owners, the large slave planters, but he has no love at all for African Americans. And what he wants really in his heart of hearts for Reconstruction is to return the nation to what it looked like in 1860, minus the institution of slavery. And the reason he wants to get rid of the institution of slavery is because it enables a few wealthy slaveholders to amass huge fortunes. And those huge fortunes are going to mean that poor guys like him, he couldn't read until he got married. His wife taught him how to read. Poor men like him aren't going to be able to rise. So basically, he wants to go back to a society based in white supremacy, but he doesn't want the large slave owners to be able to amass huge amounts of property. All right, so if that's the case, what happens? Well, one of the pieces that I never understood, like I say, this whole presidential reconstruction versus congressional reconstruction, the reason we have that division is because Congress was not in session when Lincoln was assassinated. They had disbanded right before Lincoln's second inaugural address. Literally, they'd worked all night, and they'd turned out to watch his address. It had been pouring rain that morning, but the sun broke out just as he began to speak, which many thought was a sign from God. And with that, the Republican and Democratic Congress people went back to their constituents, and this meant they went a long way. Some of them, some of them go back to California, some go back to Ohio, back to Illinois, and what that means is that when Lincoln is assassinated, Congress is not in session. Well, what people think is going to happen is that Johnson is going to call them back into session very quickly, as presidents are supposed to do, as we know after yesterday. Under Article 2, Section 3 of the Constitution, the president can call Congress back into session in cases of emergency. And that's exactly what Lincoln had done when the war broke out. Johnson wants no part of that. So the congressmen, especially the Republicans, start to come back to the city fully expecting they need to meet because now they've got this emergency on their hands. And Johnson's like, no, I got this, we're good. So he has complete control of Reconstruction from the assassination of Lincoln in mid-April of 1865 until December. It's December when Congress is set to come back into session. So he has all those months to do whatever he wants. And what he wants to do, as I say, is to return the country essentially to where it was in 1860 minus slaveholding, so that he can undercut the very rich slaveholders. So what he does is he asks the southern states to write new state constitutions. And of them, he asks only that they ratify the 13th Amendment. He wants to get rid of slavery, that they declare that they nullify the Articles of Secession. That is not simply that they say, oopsie poopsie, we shouldn't have done that, and repeal them. They have to nullify them, saying that that it is not possible for a state to secede. And they also have to declare, essentially, to declare bankruptcy, to say they won't fund any of the Confederate or state debts from the Confederacy. And the idea behind this is essentially to make sure nobody else will ever bankrupt a rebellion again, because they know they're going to lose their money. So that's all he asks of them, and they essentially do it, but they essentially do it with a really important caveat. And in the summer when they are meeting, there's a huge violence problem in the South because, again, the police system has broken down, and you've got veteran Southern Confederates coming back home. At the same time, you have African Americans searching for loved ones that they lost during slavery times, and all of them are moving around trying to find something to eat because it's spring, and springtime is always a hard time to eat in agricultural areas, and they're rubbing elbows on the dirt roads, and there's enormous violence, especially white on black violence, with this rise in violence across the South, this white on black violence, one of the things that the state conventions do in the southern states under Johnson's first rule is they not only do what Johnson asked, although not really. Some states fudge around the edges about whether or not they've repudiated their debt. But for our purposes, let's say they essentially behave. But that being said, the other thing they do is they pass what are called black codes. And black codes are a series of laws that are designed to take the people who've been newly released from slavery and essentially return them back into serfdom. And in a number of, they're all different, so I can't give you a blanket description of them. But African Americans, for the most part, are not allowed to congregate. They're not allowed to own guns. They're not allowed. They have to sign contracts that say they'll work for white owners for a year. White employers for a year. There's all sorts of restrictions on their behavior that will essentially mean that they are no longer or not a part of that free labor economy that the Republicans intended to pull them into when they passed the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. So when this happens, freed people are are terrorized, they're also furious because, among other things, for example, they've gone to work. They're working for employers, and the employers simply cheat them. They just simply say, for your 3 months of work, here's a shirt, or no, I don't owe you anything because your work wasn't very good, or whatever. And because the African Americans can't testify in court under state law, they have no recourse. So if you can't testify in a court of law, people can do anything to you. And that's precisely what happened in this violent summer. African American women were raped, men were killed, gangs traveled around, and there was nothing African Americans could do about it. So what they did is they went to the U.S. Army. And they went to the U.S. Army because in March of 1865, Congress had passed a law called the Refugees, Freedmen, a law providing for the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. And that department, that new bureau, would be within the Army because they wanted to emphasize that this was not a permanent bureau, that this would be only for the duration of the time it took for people to switch from the terror of the war into a solid free labor economy, which they thought was going to be very quickly. So what freed people do is they go to the Army and they start to talk to the officers who are members, who are part of this Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. And I keep emphasizing that name because when Congress passed the law, they made sure that it included white people first, the refugees they're talking about, then freed people, refugees, freedmen, and abandoned lands, with the idea that the officers of the Army would put freed people and refugees onto abandoned lands in order to enable them to farm and to get food for the upcoming year, because again, there's a real need to get the South up and running fast. People are literally starving in the South. So freed people who are being abused and cheated go to these Army officers. And that's really important because a study of Texas shows that the Army officers decided in favor of the freed people about 68% of the time. Probably low, to be honest, but about 68% of the time, saying that, yeah, you've been cheated, and yes, the white people you are accusing need to pony up cash or get punished or whatever. And when that happens, something really crucial happens for Reconstruction, and that's that Southern white people begin to argue that they did not fight the Civil War over slavery. Now, they fought the Civil War over slavery. They said so. Look at any of the declarations, state declarations of secession, or at Alexander Stephens's cornerstone speech, talking about the cornerstone of the Confederacy is slavery. Of course, they fought it over slavery. But in the summer of 65 and into the fall of 65, they begin to redefine the war and say, it was never about slavery. And they can do that, of course, because slavery is over. There's just no way that anybody is going to be able to return to that system because it is broken down so incredibly thoroughly over the war years. So it's not like they're going to be able to re-enslave people, although the black codes are certainly helping on that front. But they're able to say in the summer of 65, we didn't really fight the war over slavery. We fought the war over states' rights, because what we were really afraid of was this grasping government coming in and dictating the way that we interacted with our people. And what they're pointing to is the Freedmen's Bureau. And that's when it begins to be called the Freedmen's Bureau, as opposed to the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, despite the fact that it provides aid to white people as well as to black people. It provides about 150,000 rations over the summer of 65 to white people. And it provides medical care to white people as well as black people. But there you get this idea in the South, especially, and among Democrats, that the war was never about slavery. The war was really about the federal government and keeping the federal government out of their lives, and this federal government that is intrusive in their minds. All right, so what happens is that while this is going on in the summer of 65, as I say, Congress reconvenes in December of 65, and Johnson meets them, and he he says, I got great news. Reconstruction's over. I finished it while you guys were out, and I took care of everything. And what I did was I made everything. I've reorganized all the states, and everything's ready to go. And I did this because having the federal government in the southern states would have made Southerners unhappy. And that's a really important construction, because when he says Southerners there, he clearly means white Southerners, which is a real shift because, as I said before, it's the black Southerners who've been fighting for the United States government. It's the black soldiers who are the loyalists. It's the black people in the South who have been loyal to the government. And Johnson has just tossed them overboard and said, in my mind, Southerners are white people, despite the fact, again, that it's the white people who've been, trying to destroy the United States government. So first of all, there's that rhetorical construction. And he says, now all you got to do is all this the Congress has to do is it has to admit the new representatives and senators that the Southerners have elected to come back into Congress. And literally they have elected the same people who were the leaders of the Confederacy. So even though he's not in Congress yet, one of the people that he's not in Washington yet, one of the people that Georgia is going to send to sit in the U.S. Congress is Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy. Well, this, of course, makes Northerners ballistic, not least because this is 1865. And as you remember, almost 1866. And as you know, by our Constitution, the government has to take a census every decade. And from that census, it will decide how many seats everybody gets in Congress. And this is before that's limited in about 1929. Might be the early 30s, I don't remember off the top of my head. But so what this means is that people will get representation in Congress according to how many people are counted by the census. But here's the kicker. African Americans are no longer 3/5 of a person. They're going to be one whole person in the census of 1870. So Southerners are going to have more power after the Civil War in Congress than they had before the Civil War. And Congress people look at this and they say, oh, this is not happening. And to make matters worse, Johnson had said that he would not, that anybody could be readmitted to full status in the body politic by taking an oath of loyalty, with the exception of leading Confederates and people who were worth more than $20,000, which reflected his belief that they were the ones who took the Confederacy out of the Union. But he said he would pardon those people freely, and he did. By the time Congress reconvenes in December of 65, Johnson has pardoned all but about 1,500 leading Confederates. So what that means essentially is that having fought a war that takes 600,000 lives and almost $6 billion, at the end of presidential Reconstruction, Johnson is saying to Republicans who fought and won this war against the Confederacy and the Democrats who controlled the Confederacy, you are now essentially going to bring back into your political system the same people who caused the problem 5 years ago, the same people who killed 600,000 Americans and cost you $6 billion, and they're going to have more power than they did before. Okay, let's get to it. Well, there's just no way this is happening on the perspective of the Republicans. So the Republicans refuse to seat the Southerners and who are in Washington waiting to participate in the reconstructed government, and instead really quickly try to give African Americans the rights that the Black codes are denying them. And they send off a committee to talk about the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. And while that's happening, they pass two very basic laws that are designed to give African Americans civil rights. And these are very different than our civil rights today. These are essentially civic rights. They're the rights to hold property, the rights to sue against somebody, the right to testify in court, and essentially the right to have a civic identity, so they can't be abused the way they have been abused in the summer of '65 by white Southerners. They also the Republican Congress also expands the Freedmen's Bureau to do two things. I mean, to do many things, but the two I care about today are, first of all, they expand the Freedmen's Bureau to have courts, to have army courts in the South, because African Americans are not allowed to testify in state courts. So they set up national courts, they set up federal courts. And that expanded Freedoms Bureau also expands education, public education in America according to illiteracy rates. And of course, that's going to be lost in just a minute. And it's always one of those sad things. Imagine if we had really good public schools in the South since 1865, the South and the border states. It wasn't just a Southern thing, it was the border states. And it makes me even madder at Andrew Johnson to think of where we would be now if he had not done what he did, which was to veto both of these laws. Republicans thought they were uncontroversial, and they certainly should have been, but Johnson vetoed them. And the reason I'm making such a big deal about this, and now I'm going to dump a lot of Reconstruction stories, the reason I'm making such a big deal about this today is because when he vetoes them, he gives a couple of veto messages, and they're very important. Because what he does is he pulls together the Democratic complaints about the new Republican government that is responding to the will of the people. He brings together the ideas of James Henry Hammond from the 1850s and the concerns of the Democrats about the Freedmen's Bureau in the post-war years, and the concerns about the new federal taxes that I talked about 2 weeks ago, the idea that the Republican Party has invented national taxation, including an income tax during the war. And what Johnson says in his vetoes is this. He says, we cannot have laws like this, because what you are doing, first of all, is you are giving rights to African Americans that white people don't have, meaning that that African Americans are explicitly singled out in this legislation. And of course they are so because legislation in the past has only pertained to white people. But first of all, he says this is special legislation for African Americans. Mind you, it's leveling the playing field for them, but he says this is special legislation. And here's the kicker. He says you can't have laws like this because what they do is they create a federal bureaucracy that is going to have to be paid for by tax dollars. And because white people are the ones who have taxable property, African Americans couldn't own property during slavery times, because white people are the ones who own property, they are the ones who are going to be taxed. So what legislation like the expanded Freedmen's Bureau would do, or any laws that benefit African Americans by creating a bureaucracy that is going to level the playing field between them and white Americans, what such laws are going to do is they amount to a redistribution of wealth from hardworking white men to lazy African Americans who are not willing to work hard to work their way up. That construction right there, the idea that legislation leveling the playing field between white people and black people after the Civil War is a redistribution of wealth, is socialism, as people are going to start calling it in just a few years. That's where it all started. That's the same construction we have heard ever since. And that's where it started, is with Andrew Johnson's vetoes to the Civil Rights Bill of '66 and the expanded Freedmen's Bureau bill. All right, first of all, isn't that cool? But second of all, that's not where I'm stopping today, because it gets cooler. You know, Johnson actually really encourages Southern whites to fight back, and they organize the KKK and they start to lynch people. And Southern white people think that in fact they're going to be able to regain control of the South based on violence. And when I can't go into that now, unfortunately, that's a whole wonderful, but a whole nother story. And when I say wonderful, I mean for a historian. It's not wonderful for the people who live through it. But what happens in the South is that when the Southerners really think that Johnson's going to be reelected in '68, and when he is, they're going to get their own way. And when he's not, when voters instead reelect Grant, I'm sorry, not reelect, they elect Grant, and Grant cracks down on the KKK in 1871, white Southerners recognize that they've got to oppose black participation in American society, and by 1871, African-American men are able to vote through the 15th Amendment of 1870. What they realize is they got to do something else. So what they start to say is you know what? We have no problem with black people voting. Now that's ridiculous. The same people who've been complaining about African-American rights all along are making these same arguments. But they say, you know, we don't mind black people voting. It was never about race. What we don't like is poor people voting. We don't like these field hands and people who just recently worked in the kitchen having say over how our tax dollars are spent. And the state they point to is South Carolina, because in South Carolina, beginning in the 1870s, South Carolina has a legislature that is a majority African American, which reflects the population of South Carolina. But in South Carolina in 1871, a group of white Democrats organizes a convention of called the Taxpayers Convention. And what they say is, you know, this state is being terribly run. African Americans are using tax dollars to line their own pockets. To have make contracts for things that benefit them. You know, things like roads and hospitals and schools and prosthetics. By the way, a really big item in post-war budgets, because so many people have lost arms and legs and eyes. By the way, long story there, but they say, you know, our problem is not with the fact these are African Americans. Our problem is with the fact they are a poor people, and they're redistributing wealth from hardworking white people to themselves through government contracts that provides things like roads and schools. And so we as taxpayers are going to organize to fight back against this. It's a new kind of language that picks up on what Johnson was talking about, and crucially, Northerners are willing to listen to this. And I can't go entirely into why Northerners are willing to listen to this, because that itself it was actually an entire one of my books. But it matters because Northerners are who are upwardly mobile in the post-war economy are beginning to work about organized labor. Workers did not, their wages did not keep up with inflation during the Civil War, and they begin to agitate after the war for, you know, better wages and better conditions and an 8-hour day. And upwardly mobile people and businessmen and wealthy Americans in the North begin to worry about the organization of labor, of workers, especially since many of these workers after the war are going to be immigrants. So they're listening to the Southerners and they're thinking, you know, maybe they're onto something. And then in March of 1871, something dramatic happens in France. And that is that in the wake of the Franco-Prussian War, people in Paris think their government has sold them out. And so they organize and take over the city. And what happens in France itself, and how the French story is not part of what I'm talking about. I'm only going to talk about what happened in America. What happens in America is that the news about what's happening in Paris comes to America through the new transatlantic cable, which has been laid down in 1869 and was hugely expensive. So they really want to be getting news over it. And of course, news of battles and murders and bloodshed sells. So the new transatlantic cable brings news of the Franco-Prussian War, and then it brings news of the Paris Commune. And what Americans learn about the Paris Commune is that workers have taken over Paris. Now, mind you, this is what the Americans are getting. They get the idea that workers have taken over the city of Paris, and they have executed priests, they have confiscated property, they have basically ground the city to a halt, and they have so upended society that their women are taking bottles and they're filling them with this newfangled petroleum stuff, sticking rags in them, lighting them on fire, throwing them into buildings and blowing up the buildings. And this is headline news across America day after day after day. And it really helps to cement the idea that these workers are endangering civilized, and all these are in quotes, society. These workers who have organized a commune. These workers who call themselves communards. These workers who in America get translated into communists. I told you this stuff was cool. All right, so it's 1871 that Americans start to freak out about communism and socialism, which has a different linguistic history in America. But most people think about American fears of communism as really taking off with the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. No. You can go back to the New York Times or the Chicago Tribune or any of the newspapers from 1871 and see again and again and again references to the rise of communism and how communists are going to take over American society. And they're especially concerned because, of course, Karl Marx's organization has a headquarters in New York by the 1870s, and then in October of 1871, on October 8th, 1871, Chicago burns. The Great Chicago Fire starts in 1871, and instantly newspapers begin to blame immigrants. This is why we have the legend of Mrs. O'Leary's cow. Mrs. O'Leary's cow did not kick over its lamp. That was a reference to the idea that an immigrant woman would have been so stupid she would have brought fire next to straw, which was a huge no-no, of course. So because it always causes fire. So Americans become very, very nervous about the idea of communists or socialists radicalizing American workers and taking over society and redistributing wealth. And of course, where they look and what they look to is to South Carolina, where Southern Democrats are arguing this is exactly what is happening. So the Taxpayers Convention in South Carolina disbands, only saying, they can't find any wrongdoing, and they disband simply by saying, well, they should be more careful with our money. They do the same thing again in 1874. They organize again, and they again come up with nothing except the legislature should be careful with money. But what's important about 1871 through 1874 is that it cements this idea that Johnson's idea that any kind of legislation of the people, by the people, and for the people, if you will, the idea of regular, ordinary Americans having a say in their government and using the government for their own ends, roads, hospitals, and so on, is a form of communism. Is socialism, is a redistribution of wealth. All right, so, it's really tempting to stop there because that's two really big ideas, but there's two more good ones to come that fit in here. And the first is that, why is anybody listening to this? They are listening to it in part because of the American West, and because in contrast to this idea of communism, of a redistribution of wealth taking place in the East, that Democrats especially talk about, but to some degree Republicans in northern cities talk about as well because they're afraid of immigrants and workers. In contrast to that, Democrats especially launch a new vision, and that's that of the American cowboy. If you think about Reconstruction, the image of Reconstruction that we all know is not of labor leaders, and it's not of African American leaders, with the possible exception of somebody like Frederick Douglass or Robert Smalls. The image we know is that of the American cowboy. The cowboy image almost exactly overlaps Reconstruction. Cowboys come out of Texas in 1866 for the first time successfully, and they operate really until about 1886, when a terrible drought and then a terrible winter destroys the ranging cattle industry. And that's the image we have of this period. Well, why is that? The cattle industry grows in Texas during the war, and I really can't go into this at great length, although I love the cattle stories, I really do. But there had been a nascent cattle industry in Texas before the Civil War, but it operated by railhead out of St. Louis. And with the Union taking of the Mississippi River during the early part of the Civil War, and then with the degradation of Confederate railroad lines during the war, Texas cattle rangers were not able to get their cattle out of Texas. So they actually go feral in Texas, and there's so many of them running around in Texas by the end of the war that people in Texas beg Jefferson Davis to take the cattle for free because they just need to get them out of Texas. And he's like, I can't, I got no way to move them. So the Eastern soldiers in the Confederacy are eating parched corn, while Texans are afraid to leave their homes because of the longhorn cattle that are running around like squirrels out there. So what happens is, after the war, when Texas is a mess, oh my God, Texas is a mess after the war. The police system is broken down, and people are drinking what they call rifle whiskey because it will kill at 200 paces. I mean, murders are cheap. It's a terrible place after the war. Texas it's got its own fascinating history, but what happens is, after the war, Charles Goodnight recognizes, he's a former cattleman from before the war. He recognizes that if he can simply get the cattle out of Texas and to a railhead, he's going to make bank. Because if you even bother to buy a beef in Texas during 65, 66, it costs about $3 to $4 a head, but nobody's buying them. They're simply stealing them by crossing the river into Mexico. And there's this free for all across the border, and with the Comanches as well in this period, along the in the western part of the state, so, and in the panhandle. So so what Charles Goodnight figures out is that if he can round these cattle up and get them to a railhead, he will do very well, because he can sell them. You can sell you can sell cattle in a northern city for about $30 to $40 a head. Well, it's not rocket science. You just need to get them there. So he figures out how to get them there, and I don't really have time to go into how he does that. But what happens is he organizes cattle drive in after the war in '65, and he includes men who can shoot and who are desperate and who can handle a horse. So what that means is he takes former Confederates and formerly enslaved people. And one of the things that fascinates me about Charles Goodnight's early drives is that one of the people he has on his crew is a man that was dismissed from the Confederate service by reason of mental instability. So you got to figure out that when the Confederacy is taking anything that moves and they reject this guy, this is not what one would call a stable population in this cattle drive, and yet Goodnight manages to make it work. In '65, when he first tries it, the cattle get run off by the Comanche and nothing happens. But in the effort fails. But in '66, he does it again. And on his way out of Texas, he goes past a camp, and in the camp is Oliver Loving. And he and Oliver Loving were Texas Rangers together. And so they know each other, and they join forces. And they take their cattle to Bosque Redondo. If you remember me talking about Bosque Redondo, they take their cattle to Bosque Redondo, where the Army pays them $12,000 in gold. So this, they take the gold back to Texas, and the cattle rushes are on. And another historical tidbit here: they actually put that $12,000 in gold on the back of a mule, and the mule gets washed downstream at one point, and they think they're going to lose him. They do catch him, but you kind of wonder what would have happened to American history if the mule had been washed downstream and not recovered, and what the conversation was like when I'm sorry, it's not funny, but when the mule takes off and one's like, who the expletive put the gold on that mule? Anyway, so the cattle rush is on. And it's important to remember when I'm talking about the cattle industry that the real money was always at the top of the cattle industry. Studies of that industry show that the conditions of the cowboys were were as dangerous and as ill-paid as those of industrial workers. Remember, when they are driving cattle, they are up sometimes 2 days straight, so tired they're rubbing tobacco in their eyes to stay awake. They are in hideous danger all the time, not only from the cattle who stampede, seemingly randomly from a crack of thunder or a gunshot, or just because they're cattle and they feel like running. In fact, there's a wonderful account of a number of cattle drives by a man named E.C. Abbott, Teddy Blue Abbott. It's called We Pointed Them North, and it is the book on which Larry McMurtry based Lonesome Dove. And in it, he talks about a stampede and discovering after the stampede one of their fellow cow punchers who has literally been flattened. There's nothing left but a rib sticking up. And this is one of the reasons that cowboys will sing when they surround the cattle at night, because it enables them to soothe the cattle, first of all, but second of all, it tells the other cowhands where they are, so that if there's a stampede, with any luck, the cowhands can turn the stampeding cattle away from their compatriots before they are flattened. By the way, they're known as cow punchers because when they're put onto cattle cars, they will poke cow pokes or cow punchers. They will poke those cows with a stick to make sure that the ones that lay down, so they'll stand back up again, so they also don't get trampled. And those are just the dangers that the cowboys know about, and know that they can see when they cross rivers. They are likely to run into nests of water moccasins, which of course are deadly. They get caught in snowstorms. It's a terror. Of course, there are the indigenous peoples who own that land and who don't have any interest in the cattle tramping across their land. It's a terribly, terribly dangerous occupation, and the pay is terrible. There's huge money to be made in the cattle industry, but it's at the top, the same way it's at the top in mining, the same way it's at the top in industry. All that being said, according to American literature, The cowboys are the new American. They are individuals. They are hardworking, and they want nothing of the government but to be left alone so they can work their way up. And this image of the American cowboy as the antithesis of the communism, if you will, that is being developed back east as congressmen try to help African Americans enter the free labor force, becomes the dominant image of this era. And really, you could argue into the present, although it's going to die back during the Depression, when people want the federal government to be involved in their lives, even in the South and the West. But this idea of the cowboy as the quintessential American, as the man who wants nothing from the government, really gets into American society, despite the fact that the federal government is investing more resources in the American West than it ever did anywhere else, including in this period. It's investing in the railroads, it's investing in surveying, it's investing in clearing the land of the indigenous peoples who have owned it for generations, it's investing in police systems. You couldn't have settled the American West and the American plains without the intervention of the American government. And yet this image of the cowboy as being all on his own and doing it all on his own really takes hold in American literature, in the literature of the time, as Easterners who object to the idea of the federal government helping African Americans level the playing field say, that's lazy people. Cowboys are doing it all on their own. And that image of the American cowboy entirely takes off. And you have this image of the cowboy as an individualist holding his own against a federal government that is seeking to crush him and to create communism or socialism back east that is squelching American entrepreneurship and American hard work. So the cowboy becomes enormously important during Reconstruction to stand off against what Easterners and especially Democrats are calling communism or socialism. But, the cowboy really depends on that same kind of hierarchical ideology that the Confederacy had so vehemently embraced. And the reason for that is that the cowboy depends on the idea of racial and gender hierarchies. Think about it. In fact, a third of American cowboys were people of color. But think about Bonanza, for example, and I'm going to jump ahead to that much later, but think about that image of the cowboy. Where are the black cowboys in Bonanza? Where are the Hispanic cowboys in Bonanza? They're not there, because this image of the cowboy as a white American man, usually a young man, becomes this symbol of America, in part because in this era, in part because it reestablishes that hierarchical system. And you see this in the West during Reconstruction and developing in the West during Reconstruction, as in that period in the West, the United States government, in fact, reinforces racial hierarchies. And it does so, of course, most dramatically with the Indian treaties of 1866 and 1867. And what happens then is, after the war, as I said, who knows what freedom looks like? I mean, we have this idea that everybody has an equal say in American society, or should, but what does that mean? Who does that include? Are Indians, who of course have been here longer than anybody else, are they included in that? And by 1868, the US government has definitively said no. And they have said no because of the Indian raids on the Bozeman Trail, which is blazed, I think I talked about that last week, which is blazed in 1864 from the Overland Trail up into the gold fields of Montana, and because Indians are threatening the establishment of the Union Pacific Railroad. And when that happens, the US government actually engages in wars across the plains. Many of the wars have bled over from the Civil War, of course, engages in wars across the plains by quite literally moving William Tecumseh Sherman from the South out to the West to fight the Indians. I mean, he gets moved to the Department of the Missouri, which is, the name's going to change pretty quickly, but Sherman is out there really sort of emphasizing that America is still at war. And what they decide to do is a couple of important things in those early Indian wars of 67 and 68. The U.S. government decides that it's got to stop the raids on the Union Pacific and on the Bozeman Trail. And what it does is it decides to, at first it's not clear that that's going to happen. And there's a crucial letter that's written by William Tecumseh Sherman to his brother John Sherman, who's a key senator from Ohio in this era. He's the guy who backs and writes almost all of the Republican economic legislation of this era. In fact, right up until he dies in the 1890s. And what William Tecumseh Sherman says is, John, we have to protect the Union Pacific Railroad, because when the Congress chartered the Union Pacific Railroad, it made an implied promise that it would protect that railroad militarily. Well, I've read those debates. There was no implied promise of the kind in there. But it made sense to people like John Sherman that if, in fact, America was going to back this railroad, it had to back it militarily as well. And I suspect there's a good case to be made there that that's where we get the idea that the U.S. military has to protect U.S. corporations. Anyway, so that's one of the things that happens. William Tecumseh Sherman says we have to protect our Union Pacific Railroad. But there's also the problem with the fact that as settlers have blazed their way along the Bozeman Trail, the U.S. Army has been putting up forts along there, and that's Lakota territory. And the Lakota, under great leader Red Cloud and some of his best men, his best fighters, best compatriots, really. They're his peers. He doesn't own them or anything or direct them so much as fight with them. People like American Horse, a very famous Lakota leader. People like Man Afraid of His Horses, which makes him sound like a weenie, but it really means that he is such a powerful fighter that if you even see his horses, you're afraid. Under people like that, the Lakota fight back against the U.S. Army. And in a number of battles in 66 and 67, they win. They win against the Army. Most notably in 1866, there is a case where a really hubristic, an arrogant new arrival from the East thinks he can beat Red Cloud once and for all, a guy named Colonel W.J. Fetterman, and he gets lured away from a fort, and from Fort Phil Kearny, if anyone cares. He gets lured away from the fort, and American Horse and Red Cloud massacre all the people that they have lured away from that fort. Again, it's on their territory. But that, and the following year, there's another battle called the Battle of the Wagon Box fight. After that happens, the Army says, we simply have to make some kind of peace with the Lakota and with the tribes on the plains. And what happens is in 1867, they make a treaty. It's actually a series of treaties, but it's known as the Treaty of Medicine Lodge. And the Treaty of Medicine Lodge corrals all the Indians on the southern plains into a large reservation around Oklahoma. And that's why, if you think about it, we have such a large group of reservations in the area around Oklahoma. And what the Treaty of Medicine Lodge did was it said that in exchange for giving up their claim to 15 million acres of land, these tribes would have annual payments, as well as food, clothing, medical care, schools, and so on. But they've given up their right to range, and they have also promised that they'll stop killing people who are building the Union Pacific Railroad. A similar treaty happens on the northern plains, and that's the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie. And that treaty does the same thing that the Treaty of Medicine Lodge does, except the difference is that it's signed only after Red Cloud has forced the U.S. Army out of his territory. And what happens is the Congress turns to William Tecumseh Sherman and says, we can't protect both the Union Pacific Railroad and the Bozeman Trail. One of them's got to go. It's going to be the Bozeman Trail. And Sherman is like, he's really pissed. He's really angry, and he doesn't want to pull back out of down the Bozeman Trail. But finally, Red Cloud actually sends him a message and says, just so you know, we're all on the hills up here watching you guys, so you might want to hurry up a little bit. And Sherman does go, and Red Cloud burns the forts, and then he signs the Treaty of Fort Laramie, and that's known as Red Cloud's War. But what that does is it it isolates the Indians. It says they are not part of the body politic, and because they don't have a say in American society, really nobody's going to be looking out for their interests for a very, very long time. So already you have the idea by 68 that American indigenous peoples are not quite as equal as everybody else, despite all this new language about how everybody is going to have equal access to equality of opportunity. But it's not just the Indians that are read out of the American equation in the West, in the cowboy land. And this part is that I'm going to talk to you about is kind of a surprise to a lot of people. It is not a surprise to Western state historians. I'm pulling a lot of this together, but it's not, I mean, I guess some of it's original research to me, and if anybody's interested, I can tell you, you can now get these laws available online. Behind a paywall, unfortunately, but a lot of universities have that. But a lot of people have done this work, even though it sounds very surprising to people, it is on solid ground. And that is that, I'm sorry, I should finish up with the Indians. With the 14th Amendment in 1868, Congress, of course, excludes from the 14th Amendment Indians not taxed. That's all the Indians they've pushed onto reservations. So they are already not part of that 14th Amendment. But as I say, there's another loophole in the 14th Amendment. And the other loophole in the 14th Amendment is that it confirms citizenship for, quote, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. That excludes Indians, of course, but it also deliberately excludes Chinese immigrants. All right, so what happens there is that Westerners don't really care when they sign on to the 14th Amendment. They don't really care about African Americans because there just aren't that many of them in the West. Remember, they weren't supposed to go to California, for example. It was a free state, not a slave state. And they simply have not moved west yet. But Westerners are deeply concerned about Chinese people, especially Chinese men, because Chinese men who have immigrated to America are not naturalizing. They don't want to be part of American society. They want to go back home, and they are highly discriminated against. So Westerners don't want to include Chinese men in the idea that all men are created equal. So when Congress writes the 15th Amendment guaranteeing the right of people to vote without regard to race, without regard to race or previous condition of servitude, Westerners, a number of Westerners, especially in the state of Nevada, actually wrote to their Congress people back in the East and said, does this mean Chinese? Because if it means Chinese, we're not going to sign this. And there's a telegram coming back saying, no, it's only black people. You're cool. You can go ahead and sign this thing. So when the 15th Amendment is ratified, a lot of Westerners actually revolt against the Republican program and elect Democrats in the following year to Congress, saying, and into the state government, saying, we don't want any part of this whole Republican everything is equal, everybody's equal thing, because we don't want to make Chinese people. So what happens then is that you start to get in the West a continuation of the territorial laws that drew lines between, which I've talked about before, between different groups of people, Mexican Americans and Chinese Americans primarily, and of course, Indians. And the way they do that is they use a loophole. They use a loophole because there is a law passed, a series of laws, but they're codified in 1802 back east, in the Congress back east, to say that the imported Africans who are coming in that era are not going to become citizens. And what they say is, in the 1802 codification, is they say that the only people who can become citizens are free white persons. So Westerners adopt that after the Civil War to say that does not include Chinese, and it does not include Indians, of course. So the state legislatures in the West deliberately reinforce the idea that citizenship should be hierarchical according to race, and they also begin to really emphasize the idea that women are wives and mothers. Women's role in society is not as free people equal to men, but as wives and mothers. And you see this again in the cowboy imagery, where a good woman is either a wife, sort of off stage, or a prostitute. that there is no concept really in the West of this idea of women who are equal to others. And again, I talked last week about Minor v. Happersett. Minor v. Happersett is, of course, argued in Missouri, the idea that women are citizens, sure, but they don't have the right to vote, because women really fulfill their roles in American society by being wives and mothers more than by being equal to men. So what I've tried to set out today is that Reconstruction is this crucial hinge where the concept of equality of opportunity for all comes dead up against the idea of a hierarchical society embraced by the Confederacy, and that happens in the West. And what we end up with by the 1870s and the early 1880s in the West is a region that is developing its own hierarchical system that looks very much like the one that the South had developed before the war, based on the exclusion of Indians and Chinese people primarily, but also with the idea that women cannot be equal citizens. And that idea of a hierarchical society in the West is really reinforced and embodied in this really cool, popular idea of the American cowboy, who Easterners embrace as the antithesis of the communism that they argue is happening around them. It's an amazing, wonderful period in American history, and I'm done now because an hour is enough for anybody, but I just can't urge anybody enough to learn more about Reconstruction. Thanks for coming along today. Like I say, I am loosely following the story I lay out in my new book, How the South Won the Civil War, Oligarchy, Democracy, and the Continuing Fight for the Soul of America. But there are a lot of stories here, obviously, that I can tell that I didn't have room to tell in that short book. So I hope you've enjoyed it. If you did, I will see you back here next Thursday at 1 o'clock, and we'll take up the incredibly cool story of why that Western image starts to be so very important in the 1880s. Thank you very much.